Our next speaker is Nate Larkin.
Hey, my name is Nathan Larkin. I'm a senior here at Penn State. I'm excited to talk about how Penn State can take the lead on important social issues through socially responsible investing.
Oh, you weren't supposed to see that yet. All right, hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Nate, and I am a director and co-founder of Fossil-Free PSU. I'll get to explaining exactly what it is we do as an organization in just a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why the organization exists. And that's because we all believe that Penn State is a force for good in society, even beyond the confines of campus. A few examples of this, obviously Thon, right? But the list doesn't stop there. One of my favorite things to point out is that we have multiple climate scientists that are members of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. The All In campaign fosters an attitude of diversity and inclusion that we'll all carry with us after we leave campus. And this is a picture of a bridge that was built by a group called Bridges to Prosperity. And it's just one example of all the good work that student organizations do here. In Bridges to Prosperity, students volunteer their time to go to poor countries and build walking bridges to help vitalize communities. So Penn State can be a great force for good. These are just a couple examples that I picked out, but it goes on from there. One area where we can do better, though, is fighting climate change. And that's where Fossil-Free comes in. Fossil-Free is a group that's dedicated to fighting climate change from a social justice perspective. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand climate change to be a social justice issue. And that's why one of the things that we spend a lot of our time doing is organizing events on campus to help spread awareness of the link between social justice and climate change. So this is one thing we did last semester. We hosted a discussion roundtable session with the NAACP at Penn State, the Asian Pacific American Caucus, and the Latino Caucus to talk about the intersection of racial justice and climate change. Before that, last year, we held an event at Old Main called Onward on Climate that we co-sponsored with 32 other student organizations that include social justice groups, faith-based groups, political groups, other environmental groups, and more. This is actually a photo from that event, one of our speakers and some of the attendees. And what we wanted to highlight there was one injustice in particular, and that's that some of the wealthiest corporations in the entire world, fossil fuel companies, become exceedingly more wealthy by perpetuating climate change, while climate change has its worst impacts on the poorest, most marginalized people in the world. So there are obvious social justice issues with this dynamic that's going on. So that's why we wanted to have this event and urge Penn State to take a more active role in fighting climate change. So as you might imagine, I was pretty happy when Penn State last year released their strategic plan for 2016 through 2020, and these were the 5 themes that they identified. And I bet you can assume which one I want to expand on. So stewarding our planet's resources. Penn State defines it as Penn State will be a leader in creating comprehensive solutions to mitigate the dangers of climate change and address the challenges of providing safe and abundant water, clean and renewable energy sources, and plentiful and nutritious food. Okay, that's a mouthful. But I want to focus on these 2 words right here, comprehensive solutions. Because the fact is, Penn State already does a lot of things really well when it comes to fighting climate change. You heard from Doug that our recycling program might leave something to be desired, but it still is one of the most highly ranked ones in the country. The 2015 senior class gift was a solar panel array, and we're home to some of the most esteemed climate scientists in the entire world. So there's a lot that we're doing really well. But any comprehensive solution should include using all the tools that we have at our disposal. And right now, we're not using what's probably the most effective tool that we have for fighting climate change, and that's the university's endowment. Penn State's endowment is $3.6 billion. It's the 33rd largest university endowment in the entire country. So an endowment is essentially a savings account for a school or college or university, for those who might not know. It can be used to fund any and all aspects of a university, whether it be student scholarships, research grants, capital infrastructure projects, you name it, the endowment is probably behind it. So obviously, with all this great stuff that we can do with the endowment, Penn State wants it to grow. So we have a group of people that invest it in stocks, mutual funds, directly into companies, anywhere that we can get a good return on our investment so that we can keep making Penn State even better. But $3.6 billion is a lot to be throwing around, and it can have positive or negative social consequences depending on the way that we invest it. That's why a lot of schools and other institutions have adopted a strategy of socially responsible investing. It basically means investing so that you maximize the benefits of your money and minimize the negative consequences. And one part of socially responsible investing is what's called divestment. It's actually the opposite of investment. So divesting is when you take money that you have invested in one company or group of companies and move it somewhere else. Now, most of the time, the institutions do this, it's because they disagree morally or ethically with a group of companies, a specific company, an entire industry, etc. And most of the time, divestment happens as a campaign where you have lots of institutions divesting at the same time to protest a specific issue. So one divestment campaign that I want to focus on, probably the most notable one that we've ever seen, took place in the 1980s when college students across the country mobilized to get their institutions to divest from South African-based businesses. And that's because in South Africa, there was still racial segregation that mirrored 1950s America, where Jim Crow laws were essentially still in place in South Africa into the early 1990s. So students across the country got their institutions to divest, and that was a huge factor behind getting the US Congress to pass sanctions on South Africa in 1986 to get them to end this segregation and social injustice. Now, the US Congress passed a law in 1986. This is a picture of Penn State students marching on Old Main in 1985, but Penn State was one of the last institutions to divest from South African-based companies. We didn't do so until 1987. So let that sink in for just a second. The US Congress moved more quickly than Penn State did. So I think now, looking back, we can hopefully all agree we were on the wrong side of history by dragging our feet on this issue. And unfortunately, we may be repeating ourselves with the modern divestment movement that's happening, and that's the fossil fuel divestment movement. So there are fossil fuel divestment campaigns going on at over 400 colleges and universities across the country, and even more globally. Some really notable institutions have already divested. Our Big Ten colleague, the University of Maryland, has divested. Syracuse University has divested. Stanford University has divested. I could stand up here and list all the schools that have divested. Well, I couldn't off the top of my head, but I could list a lot of schools that have divested. It would take too long. Other schools have established task forces, subcommittees to look at divestment. But at Penn State, we haven't taken any action yet. So what's important to keep in mind about divestment is that you can use it to do more than just protest social injustices. Take public health, for example. Penn State has recently shown an interest in the public health effects of smoking tobacco. This is a headline from a few weeks ago when President Barron announced that he was going to create a task force to look at banning tobacco smoking on campus. And while that's great, if we really want to take a comprehensive solution to the public health impacts of smoking tobacco, we should attack the problem from point A by divesting from tobacco companies, in addition to point B by banning smoking on campus. So there are obvious sort of moral and ethical arguments for not being invested in companies that you think are, having negative social consequences. But there's also a strong financial argument for socially responsible investing. Take fossil fuel divestment, for example. This is a graph that shows the S&P 500 modeled against what's called the fossil-free index. It's an index that is proportionally identical to the S&P 500, except it filters out fossil fuel companies. As you can see, the two indexes perform almost identically, except for recently, the fossil-free index has been outperforming the S&P 500. So there's a strong ethical argument for socially responsible investing. There's a financial argument that says we can continue to uphold our financial obligations as a university and maybe even get better returns on our investments. But the conversation isn't happening at Penn State, and that's why I really wanted to bring it to State of State. A lot of schools, as I mentioned, have established subcommittees on their board of trustees or task forces within their administration. And And doing something like that at Penn State, engaging stakeholders across the community, engaging the administration, the Board of Trustees, student governments like the UPUA, the CCSG, the GPSA, student organizations like Fossil Free, or maybe student organizations that disagree with Fossil Free. It's an incredible opportunity to have a dialogue as a community and really do some soul searching about what we want the impact of our university to be beyond the confines of campus. How do we want to impact the state of Pennsylvania? How do we want to impact the United States? And if we're talking about an issue like climate change, how do we want to impact the entire world? So that's the conversation I hope we can have today. Thank you, everybody, very much.